All-in-one liquid coolers, ARGB all-in-one liquid coolers, they're expensive, but do they have to be? So this is an all-in-one liquid cooler from Corsair, a 360mm variant, and it costs a pretty £170, which is quite the splash of cash. Of course, I did send this one over to me, by the way, in the last video, which I reviewed, so if you want to take the information and do what you will with it, please do. But however, I have got a budget variant here in the form of the PC cooler G.H150i/P Halo. They both share uncomfortably long names. But the question is budget worth it? Well, I guess we'll find out. Okay, it's a painful name, so from now on we're calling it the Halo, alright? Good. So, the Halo, that's better, can be picked up for around £90 and possibly your regional equivalent if they sell it anywhere else. I picked it up for about £35 new on a sale with a couple of other super cheap coolers just because I was curious. Specifically now about what a 360mm ARGB AIO is like when it's nearly half the price of another 360mm ARGB AIO in the form of the Corsair H150i RGB Pro XT. Side note, why do the names of the products feel compelled to compete with the size of the products? Anyway, I've covered the H150i already, so let's take a closer look at the Halo before we get into the test results. Unboxing wise, it's basically the same as the H150i Pro XT, same packaging more or less, so hard to complain. Contents though, that's another story. So we've got all the parts bags and a box, and like the H150i, there's plenty of stuff here, but there's more clutter and less substance with the Halo. So where the H150i could deal with Threadripper, the Halo can't, but can deal with the mainstream AMD and Intel sockets. The Halo also has a strange backplate with a B. So much for the manual. It's normally called a Mylar sheet or something along those lines, but that's a brand name, I think. Anyway, it's a sticky back plastic sheet to prevent you from shorting out components on the back of your motherboard. I didn't actually need it for all it's worth. We've also got a boatload of cables. One of these cables can be used to provide power to the fans and pump, with the speed being controlled by a fan header, and the other three sets of cables cover the ARGB control. One is an ARGB splitter, and this can be coupled with either the universal addressable ARGB connector to the board or a controller, or with the controller they provide, which requires a Molex connector. Moving on to the fans, these are actually not too bad. The GIXXR, another messy name, had a very similar fan frame, both from the same company. You can even notice the raised edge where it had LED strip lighting. On the Halo, these fans don't have a strip-lit frame, but rather a lit hub with translucent blades. The blades retain the ribbed backing, which should be pleasing someone, dead joke, and the corners of the frames have that rather interesting thing going on. The wires exiting the fan, by the way, are a 4-pin PWM fan connector and a 3-pin ARGB connector. Fans done, let's move on to the main article, the pump and radiator. We'll start with the radiator since it's the simplest, not a huge amount to say here. Like the H150i, it's predominantly aluminium. They're both 27mm thick and they're both radiators. But there is something to be said about the style of the H150i over the Halo. Is it worth the price difference of £80? Probably not. However, reliability might play a role into there somewhere, and these connections don't seem very robust to me. Moving over to the pump, I have to say the pump top styling is rather garish and doesn't light pleasingly, in my opinion at least. I also have another opinion about the base plate. I'm sure you would too if you saw this. Yeah, not a great look. I double checked the screws to see if any were loose, but no, all of them were tight as a duck's ass. So I gave it a good clean and left it overnight. A light check confirmed in the morning that there wasn't anything leaking, so we've got the all clear to mount it to the test bench. But just before we do, when I first picked up the Halo, I was a little surprised by its weight, more specifically how light it was. Now, I'm not saying my home workouts have clearly been working. I can probably count the workouts I've done across the 4 months of lockdown so far on my hands. Maybe just the one. No, this thing doesn't feel hefty. The best way to settle this is with a weigh-in. So comparing it to the Corsair H150i, yeah, you know the rest, which comes in at about 1,050 grams, the Halo comes in at about 825 grams, just over a 20% reduction in weight. Make of that what you will, it's 20% less of something. Anyway, let's get into the install, starting with the radiator. I mean, we're installing a radiator. I'm struggling to make any thrilling commentary. Let's shift our attention to the pump. The mounting hardware for this is more complex than I'd like, but it's robust enough to not raise any alarm bells. It relies on several stages of washers to keep the bolts on the backplate and the backplate on the board, but I rather like the large nuts. Yes, haha, that the screws went right through, not so haha. It seems like quite a simple and effective way of forming a solid platform for the pump, if you forget about all the messing around with the washers, of course. A note on hooking up the pump for control. So like with the fan, you have a 3-pin connector for lighting control, which you can connect to the splitter provided and connect to whatever way you want to control the lighting. But there's also a 3-pin connector for the speed control of the pump, meaning DC control. Now, while it is possible to hook up a DC fan or pump to a PWM interface, such as a fan controller like my NZXT grid, or a PWM motherboard header, many of which do allow for DC control as well, you'll want to make sure you're controlling the speed with DC, not PWM. I tried for a good half an hour to get the pump to run off my NZXT grid, but unlike a 3-pin fan, the pump was never able to maintain speed, probably something to do with the resistance of the liquid needing more constant power to stop the impeller from stalling, or just some other power issue. I don't know, but what I do know is that connecting it to a DC chassis fan header on the motherboard solved the problem, but that meant I didn't have great control over its speed, so I set it to the quiet curve for the acoustic test and the performance curve for the full fan speed test. I would have set it to 50% and 100%, but that wasn't working for some reason. I know it defeats the point of the otherwise relatively well-controlled testing, but if it's the only reasonable way, then what can I do? And it seems to be common knowledge that pump speed doesn't yield better temps on the whole, although that's something I want to look into, I think. Anyway, with all this talk of temperatures, pump speeds, fans, let's get on with some testing. We'll start with Priority 5 with the acoustically limited fan speed, as in the fans have been slowed down, or sped up depending on which way you look at it, until they have met the target noise output of 36.5 dBA, 40 centimeters away at a 45-degree angle from the fans. And would you look at that, top of the board, the Halo has done it. It's beaten the H150i. Don't break open the champagne just yet, though. When I say beaten, I mean it's more of a technical victory. It is well within the margin of testing error to the H150i and the Mugen 5 for that point, so we can only conclude they basically perform the same here. More on that later. Spinning the fans up to full speed, the H150i opens the gap up, so the Halo performs as well as the Mugen 5 and better than everything else, minus the H150i. But you could say the performance jump of the H150i is kind of cheating. What do I mean by cheating? Well, switching to the stats for this test, the H150i at full fan speed is pushing out over 52 dBA compared to the 44 decibels with an A weighting of the Halo and 38-ish dBA of the Mugen 5. I mean, sure, I could attach a leaf blower to the Mugen 5, which might shave off a few degrees, but it's not really realistic. Noise-wise. Yeah, I know it's kind of a tortured analogy, but 52 dBA is only bearable long-term if you love noise-cancelling headphones or dislike being in the same room as your computer. Anyway, moving on to Firestrike with the acoustically limited fan speed, the results seem a bit strange to me. With Priority 5, where the CPU was using about 90 watts, the Halo was performing equally to the H150i, but with Firestrike pushing the average CPU usage to about 60 watts, the Halo is performing noticeably worse than the H150i. You'd have thought just turning down the wattage would have yielded a similar change for both, but maybe this is an indication that the Halo doesn't deal with less consistent CPU usage as well as the H150i does. Oh, and since I didn't show the acoustic stats before, to meet the acoustic target, the fan speed of the H150i was nearly half that of the Halo, which explains a fair amount of the performance difference between the acoustic and full fan speed test results. And finally, moving on to the full fan speed Firestrike test results, as before, the H150i steams ahead in both thermal performance and poor acoustic performance, and the Halo hangs back behind the Mugen 5, which could further support the poorer inconsistent CPU wattage handling theory, since with Priority 5 it was equal in performance at full speed to the Mugen 5. Anyway, that's enough reading into it too much. Let's deal with the price situation. So here's the bummer when it comes to price. Yes, the Halo is nearly half the price of the H150i Pro XT, but only if you get your hands on it. Like I said at the start, it's £90 in a few shops in the UK, but trying to find it elsewhere wasn't possible for me, and I can't even find it on Alibaba like the super cheap air coolers I'd previously reviewed. So for the sake of some comparative data, I've converted the pounds into euros and dollars. So what does this mean for the value of the cooler? Well, the price versus performance graph basically reads like the rough price graph. The Halo has nearly double the value of the H150i Pro XT, but how could this be? Well, the price difference is likely down to the cheaper components. I don't think it's simpler to explain than that, and as far as I can find on the box, the website, and in the documentation, I don't think the Halo has a warranty. Compare that to the 5-year warranty with the H150i, and you can imagine a potential scenario where the Halo needs replacing within a 5-year period out of your own pocket, which would then cost more than one of the H150i Pro XTs, if you went for the same cooler, of course. At least with the H150i Pro XT, you'd have something working to sell within that 5-year period, as long as you didn't do something abnormal to break it, of course. And the other side of the price versus performance coin being the performance similarity. I'd say they performed more similarly than different, but there's certainly an argument to be had for the Halo performing more like a large air cooler like the Mugen 5. Either way, with its current performance, it looks like even the 90-watt Priority 5 10-minute torture test didn't push it to its limits. So performance-wise, I can see this thing dealing with at least 140 watts well enough, but I'm not fully confident it'll push all the way up to the 200 watt mark like the Corsair H150i Pro XT seems set to, or the 250 watts that it claims on the website. I'm sorry, I misspoke. I meant when I said 250 watt, it was actually claiming 350 watt TDP support. I mean, TDP is a vague figure at the best of times, but 350 watts, it's a lot of power, and that is, I mean, the Corsair H150i in the review guide was recommending, you know, to go up to 200 watts for testing, but 350, yeah. It's the same with the other cheap coolers they make. They claim 90 watts for a tiny cooler and 160 watts for a mildly larger cooler. It's all over the shop. So, yeah, don't even go near a 350 watt processor with this thing. Please. But then again, would you put your trust in a cooler without a warranty that holds a substantial amount of liquid to be clamped to a 200 watt CPU? I don't think so. I personally wouldn't trust strapping this thing to a pricey CPU. Not one that I'd want to at least have hanging around for a good number of years or long term. See, the difficulty is with a budget all-in-one liquid cooler, ARGB, all that sort of stuff aside, is that it's priced at a very expensive air cooler price. So you're looking at air cooler performance, which you do get, but it's built and it has the support from the company of a budget air cooler. So it's really difficult to justify going for something so damn cheap when there's potential that it could ruin whatever you strap it to. So, I mean, the only way you could really justify putting something that potentially doesn't have the life or a long lifespan is putting it on a budget CPU cooler, or it's a budget CPU. But again, like I just said, it makes no sense because it's too expensive. It's at the price of a big air cooler. So you may as well go for a mid-size air cooler and be done with it. Well, yeah, mid-size air cooler, it's small enough so that it would probably fit in most cases unless you have to go AIO, but even 120mm tall air cooler, it's cheaper than that and it has great performance. The D9L, the U9S from Noctua. So then it comes down to, is it worth going for the expensive 360mm all-in-one liquid cooler? Well, it pretty much is the opposite of that. If you've got a very expensive CPU and it's very powerful, you want the cooling. So yes, you may want to go for something like a big all-in-one liquid cooler. It might be one of your only options, depending on your case and depending on the CPU. Where maybe you can't go for, say, a big air cooler in one of those situations. But it does have a big price to it. And at least it is backed up by a 5-year warranty. So you got some coverage there. So yeah, it seems like a decent idea to go to one of these things, but in reality, you're playing with fire. It is a gamble. Of course, you can't guarantee either of them are going to survive it, but at least if one breaks and has a problem, you can swap it out and it's not going to charge you anymore unless you did something wrong with it, like I said. But if this breaks and it takes your stuff with you, you spend a lot of money compared to a cooler with reasonable performance for a CPU that perhaps would only need reasonable performance. And yeah, you're kind of going to be left in the dirt there. So that's all I can say about it. Would I recommend this for the performance? Yes. For the durability and longevity? No. No, not really. So anyway, I hope that covers that. Again, just because Corsair sent us over last review, I thought I was pretty clear in the last review that unless you're getting a monster CPU, you really don't want to get the Corsair variant because it's too expensive. But yeah, so I'm not saying get that one, don't get that one. I'm saying if you're looking at the price range of that thing, you can get a really good air cooler for that price, and you've got a hell of a lot more security in an air cooler. It isn't going to destroy your stuff, and you've got less parts for failure, such as the pump, with a large air cooler or even a mid-sized air cooler. And yeah, it just won't bite you in the back if your CPU only needs mid-sized CPU cooler performance, air cooler wise. So anyway, so I'm not saying jump for the really big one, the most expensive one. Go for one that is reasonable. Yes, it is flashy to have ARGB stuff there, but go for some fans at the front of your case. You're gonna have a much better time, especially if a year down the line this thing busts a leak and it takes your CPU, motherboard, maybe even the RAM, maybe the power supply unit, and could even be your graphic. I mean, it takes the whole system with it. You might kick yourself a little bit on that one for cheaping out on a expensive version or expensive option when you could have mid-ranged or mid-leveled in a more reasonable air-cooled version. I'm just repeating myself now. Thanks for checking this video out. If you want to check more videos out, it's over there. If you want to subscribe and support the channel over on that side, thank you so much for checking this one out, and I will catch you in the next video, which will be a desk review. Yeah, I think I'll do a desk review.